Set in 1902, the movie begins by showing an Englishman named Orlando Oxford on his visit to South Africa. He invited his wife, Emily, and son, Conrad. Apart from that, Orlando was also accompanied by his servant, Shola. Orlando was a British nobleman who worked for the International Red Cross, and he came to Africa to visit his friend, a general named Kitchener, one of the military officers who accommodated government exiles. As a member of the Red Cross, he wanted to ask Kitchener for an explanation regarding the suffering of the people who had been thrown into the camp, because according to the information, the exiles had been treated like animals. Outside the camp, Emily explained to Arthur that all humans were equal and should be treated fairly. Therefore, she chose to become a member of the Red Cross so that she could help others, especially those who suffered from the prolonged war. After explaining this, Emily intended to meet her husband inside the camp, but when the gate opened, a rebel shot at them. The shot from the rebel hit Emily, causing a great injury for her. Seeing his wife in pain, Orlando tried to stop the blood that was coming out profusely, but it was all in vain. Before she breathed her last, she told Orlando to always protect Conrad from war, lest he suffer the same fate as her. Hearing this, Orlando could only cry hysterically. 12 years later, Conrad was 18 years old. Since his mother's death, he went through his days in sorrow. Meanwhile, Orlando tried his best to always love his only son. Not only did he love him so much, but he also trained him to be able to protect himself from enemies. He didn't want his son to suffer the same fate as Emily, and because of that, he taught him how to pilot an aircraft and asked Shola to train him in martial arts. On the other hand, Orlando tried to hide his sadness in front of Conrad so that his son could move on from the death of his mother 12 years ago. Orlando always poured out his sadness to Shola and his assistant, Polly. They were both the people he trusted most to help him in letting go of Emily. However, he would never forget the incident when a rebel bullet pierced his wife. In the afternoon, Orlando took Conrad to the tailoring shop patronized by the British nobles known as Kingsmen, told to be the best in the world. In this shop, he wanted to buy his son a suit so that he looked more dignified, but Conrad felt uncomfortable wearing noble clothes like that. He instead preferred combat clothes because he wanted to go to war with the British troops. However, Orlando had promised his late wife to keep him away from the war. Shortly after, the two met with Kitchener and his aide named Morton. After exchanging news, Kitchener spoke privately with Orlando in a secret room. He wanted to ask Orlando to maintain the security of an Austrian nobleman who was going to visit Serbia since he was the most important person in the Austrian kingdom. According to him, Orlando was the most fit to do the mission because he was one of the best the British ever had. As a person who was against violence initially, Orlando refused the request, but because Kitchener was a relative of Emily, he finally wanted to help. Somewhere else, there was a secret organization that had its headquarters in remote mountains under the guise of a goat farm. This organization was led by a mysterious bald man they called the Shepherd, while the members were officials from various European countries. As assigned membership, each of them has a ring bearing an animal symbol, implying they were all the flocks of the Shepherd. Inside the ring was a cyanide pill that must be swallowed by the members if they failed to carry out a mission. The Shepherd had evil intentions to create wars between countries so that he could take advantage of the situation to rule the world. Therefore, he ordered one of his members named Princip to finish off the Austrian nobleman. The Shepherd aimed to free the Serbian people from Austrian colonialism so that the Serbian people would put up resistance and world war would definitely break out. Princip immediately started his mission by preparing explosives to kill the nobleman. After the explosives were ready, he walked to the window to check the arrival of his target. It was seen the Austrian nobleman named Ferdinand with his wife and Orlando, who had promised Kitchener to protect him from unexpected attacks. Apart from looking after Ferdinand, he also invited Conrad to come along while teaching him how to become a nobleman. But not long after that, Princip appeared and immediately threw the explosive. But thankfully, Orlando managed to secure Ferdinand. Even though he succeeded in securing Ferdinand, he regretted having invited Conrad on this mission. He did not expect that the threat Ferdinand faced was so big. On the other side, Princip, who felt that his duty had failed, decided to swallow the pills inside his ring. But before swallowing the pill, he saw another opportunity to finish off Ferdinand, and without wasting more time, he immediately took a gun and shot him. Because of that, Ferdinand and his wife died horribly. After failing to protect Ferdinand, Orlando and Conrad boarded the train to return to England. They felt guilty because they were not able to carry out their duties properly, knowing that Ferdinand's death could trigger great chaos in Europe. After discussing Ferdinand's death, Orlando told Conrad a story about three children who had a sibling bond. It was said that the three grew up to become leaders of three large countries in Europe. They were Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, Tsar Nicholas of Russia, and King George V of England. Of the three, only King George had the intention to maintain world peace. Therefore, he sent a letter to Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas so that they would not be provoked by the murder of Ferdinand. A few weeks later, the letter finally reached Kaiser Wilhelm, but it turned out that the Kaiser's aide, Erich, was the shepherd's flock. He suggested that the Kaiser ignore the letter and choose to declare war. In fact, he also tried to pit Kaiser Wilhelm and his two cousins, King George and Tsar Nicholas. Since Germany allied with Austria while Russia had a big influence in Serbia, these two countries were already on two very opposite axes, while England was an ally of Russia. In another place, Tsar Nicholas had an advisor named Rasputin who served as the shepherd's flock as well. Rasputin, who had the same purpose as Erich, lured Tsar Nicholas to declare war against Germany and England. The news of the declaration of war spread throughout Europe in a short time. Orlando and Kitchener discussed about it. According to them, King George had to move quickly to stop it. On the other side, Conrad seemed eager to take part in the World War, but Orlando had to oppose his wishes for his safety. A week later, Germany and Russia sent troops into war to secure their area, and in the end, World War I broke out. The days passed full of blood and millions of people died in endless war. Of course, this made the shepherd happy because his goal had been fulfilled. He then started his next plan, which was to take revenge for the suffering of the Scottish people, his own people, because for years, England had oppressed Scotland. He would remove Russia from the war and then use German troops to attack England. On the other hand, Conrad heard the news that the British military was looking for volunteers to take part in the war. He persuaded his father to allow him to join the troops, but Orlando remained firm in forbidding him to get involved in any war. He then talked about his youth where he served as Queen Victoria's trusted soldier. He even received a medal, but after that, he really regretted his actions because he had killed hundreds of people. At the same time, Rasputin was seen putting poison into Tsar Nicholas's son's food, and not long after that, the child had a seizure. This time, he was assigned by the shepherd to persuade Tsar Nicholas to get his country to withdraw from the war. As an advisor who was believed to have magic powers, Rasputin used that to tell Tsar Nicholas that he had to step down from the war so that his son could survive. Even though at first he was doubtful, the Russian leader finally followed Rasputin's advice. Since that day, Tsar Nicholas and his wife had become increasingly influenced by Rasputin, especially since Rasputin deliberately drugged them to believe him with drugs. Seeing this, Conrad's cousin who lived in the Russian palace sent a letter to him, saying that he needed his help in eliminating Rasputin to protect the Russian Empire. Conrad then told Kitchener and Morton about that. Morton proposed that Kitchener send troops to resolve this problem. Of course, Conrad wanted to join the troops, but again, Orlando forbade him. In the evening, Kitchener and Morton left for Russia using a ship. On their trip, Kitchener read secret documents relating to the war. Unfortunately, nobody realized that a German submarine was secretly following the ship and the people controlling the submarine were the shepherd's flock. They immediately fired the torpedo at the ship until it exploded. The next day, the news of Kitchener's death spread throughout England, and of course, as a friend, Orlando felt lost. Before he died, Kitchener had sent a letter to him. Inside the letter were praises for Orlando's anti-war principles. Apart from that, he also hoped that Orlando would allow Conrad to join the war because he saw great potential inside the young man. After reading Kitchener's letter, Orlando also invited Conrad to a secret room where Polly and Shola were inside. All this time, Orlando had been secretly looking for the conspiracy behind the World War. He and his two servants had gathered various clues but had not been able to solve the mystery, therefore, he decided to take his son on that important mission. Conrad was shocked by all the things he saw. He did not expect that his father was a special British intelligence to investigate serious cases. Orlando then explained that he had deliberately kept his job a secret so that Conrad could live like an ordinary person, but he finally wanted to involve him in this mission because Conrad had grown into an intelligent and powerful man. Orlando told Conrad that he had interrogated Princip about the murder of Ferdinand in Serbia, and based on the information he got, they concluded that there was a secret organization deliberately creating a war to dominate the world. On the other hand, Polly received information from one of the Russian informants that Rasputin tried to brainwash Tsar Nicholas to withdraw from the war, and if that happened, then England would be Germany's next target. Apart from this information, she also said that Rasputin had the same ring as Princip, meaning they came from the same organization. Hearing this, Orlando was forced to violate his promise to never kill people again because he had to kill Rasputin to protect his country. The next day, Orlando and the team went to a party attended by Rasputin. Orlando planned to take advantage of his son's handsomeness to attract Rasputin because it turned out that Rasputin was a homosexual, but when during the mission, Rasputin was more interested in Orlando, so like it or not, Orlando was forced to go on with the new plan. He lured Rasputin into a room and showed the war scar on his knee. When he saw that, Rasputin promised to heal the scar with the power he had, but before that, he ate the cake on the table that had been poisoned with cyanide. Short story, Rasputin carried out a very strange ritual to heal the wound on Orlando's knee, but it turned out to be his way of hypnotizing Orlando. In the end, he found out that Orlando aimed to kill him with cyanide poison. Strangely, Rasputin only vomited once without experiencing any seizures. He then told Orlando, who had been hypnotized, to soak in ice water. He said that cyanide would not work on his body, and after saying that, he tortured Orlando by drowning him in the ice water. Outside, Conrad and Shola became worried about Orlando's safety. When they saw Rasputin torturing Orlando, Shola told Conrad to save his father while he was going to fight with Rasputin. Unfortunately, Rasputin managed to stab Shola with his cross, which contained poison to paralyze him. Conrad immediately shot the cross and used all his strength to fight Rasputin. Orlando finally regained his consciousness. Seeing Conrad fighting for his life, he immediately helped. Even though Orlando had stabbed Rasputin many times and drowned him in ice water, he was able to get up again, until Polly came and shot him right in the head. After hearing of Rasputin's death, the shepherd was furious because it had ruined his plans, and to fix everything, he sent his other flock named Lenin, a politician with a communist ideology who wanted to carry out a revolution in Russia. On the other hand, Orlando and the others were on their way back to England. They celebrated the death of Rasputin with a toast and at the same time, celebrated Conrad's 19th birthday. At this happy moment, Conrad again asked for permission to join the military, but his father still held to his promise to his mother. Finally, he decided to go to the military headquarters without permission. On the other hand, Eric was persuading Kaiser Wilhelm to send a radio telegraph to the American president to prevent America from allying with the British Army, but then the message was heard by the British Navy led by Morton. And of course, an insider in the Navy leaked the secret message to Orlando and his team. After Polly broke the secret code, she finally found out that Germany had not sent the message to the President of America, but to the Mexican leader. In the message, Germany invited Mexico to form an ally by attacking the American camp. Hearing this, Orlando was quite relieved because if America joined the war, England would be helped and Conrad would have a higher chance to survive. At the same time, Conrad had joined the British military and was carrying out training in preparation for war against Germany. In this training, the soldiers were indoctrinated to be willing to die for their country and not be afraid of enemy forces, even though Germany was one of the most powerful countries in the world. Short story, Orlando reported about the secret code to King George. The king was optimistic that the war would end quickly and Conrad would return home safely from the war, so he asked Orlando to believe that his son could get through the war. On the other hand, the American president didn't believe the rumor circulating. According to him, it was just Germany's ploy to pit Mexico and America against each other. At British Army headquarters, Conrad was summoned by his superiors to withdraw from the war force and would be assigned as a security guard in London. Hearing this, Conrad realized that the order came from his father, and because he still wanted to fight in the war, he decided to exchange identities with the corporal. Then he wrote a letter of apology to his father, which he entrusted to the corporal, and when Orlando read the letter, he felt very worried, afraid that his son would not be able to come home safely. However, Conrad seemed very confident that he would be one of the soldiers who received the award medal. The next day, Conrad and the other British troops left for the battlefield. He felt the situation was very tense and the shooting was non-stop. Not long afterward, there was a German soldier who ran towards their post, but it turned out that the soldier was a British spy who was carrying an important message. Therefore, the commander asked 6 volunteers to look for the whereabouts of the spy who seemed to have been hit by an explosion. Of course, Conrad immediately volunteered to take part in the mission. In this mission, the 6 had to be able to retrieve the important message that was brought by the spy, and so that there would be no firefight, they left in the middle of the night. Unfortunately, the German soldiers were also targeting the spy. In the end, the battle could not be avoided. Unfortunately, the 5 volunteers died in the battle and only Conrad managed to survive. He cried uncontrollably because it turned out that his father's words were true. The war was very scary. He could feel the fear that his father meant. Surprisingly, Conrad met the spy he had been looking for, but unfortunately he had lost a leg, so Conrad decided to carry him to the base. Seeing Conrad carrying the spy on his back, the British soldiers immediately gave cover fire so that the German soldiers would not launch an attack. Conrad would soon be given a medal award for his action, but there was one of the soldiers who was suspicious of him, especially since Conrad had exchanged identities with a corporal. The corporal's friend, who was also involved in the war, felt strange. He accused Conrad of being a German spy and suddenly shot his head. A few days later, the corporal returned to visit Orlando to tell him that Conrad had died in the war. Orlando fell silent and blamed himself for breaking his promise to Emily. He could only mourn the death of the two people he loved very much. Fortunately, Conrad did not die in vain because the information he brought from the spy convinced the President of America to help England in the World War. Meanwhile, King George received the news that Tsar Nicholas had resigned from his throne after being pressured by Lenin and his followers. On the other hand, Eric apologized to the shepherd because he could not prevent America from joining the war, but the shepherd was not at all angry with him. He then sent a female flock whose name was Mata Hari to approach the American president with her beauty in the hope that the president would be seduced and withdraw from the war. Amid the increasingly precarious war, Orlando was still mourning and could only stare at a photo of his wife and son while drinking alcohol to calm himself. Not long after, King George visited him and gave him a medal of appreciation for Conrad's services during the war. Apart from that, he also asked Orlando to collect himself because America had been influenced by Germany and refused to help England, but Orlando no longer cared about the war because all that was on his mind was Emily and Conrad. Seeing that, Polly tried to persuade him to get up and not let Conrad's death be in vain. Thanks to her, Orlando finally regained his spirit and decided to continue the fight for Conrad. Long story short, Polly sent an informant to the American president's office to dig up as much information as possible, and it didn't take long for the informant to finally get news that the American president had been blackmailed by a woman from the embassy. The woman had seduced the president, recorded an indecent scene with him, and then threatened to spread the scandal if the American president helped England in the war. The woman was none other than Mata Hari. Orlando immediately went to the American embassy office. There he saw a red scarf similar to Princip's, and it was true that the owner of the scarf was Mata Hari. Because her cover had been revealed, the woman had to eliminate Orlando. After knocking out Mata Hari, the American embassy showed Orlando the scandal video of the president and asked him to find the real film roll and destroy it. That way, the American president could be free to send reinforcements to England. When he returned from the embassy, Orlando asked the Kingsman tailor to find the origin of the red scarf. According to the tailor, the scarf was made from sheep's wool that came from a specific place in the mountain. Without further ado, Orlando invited Shola and Polly to go to the place. The place was heavily guarded, so to shorten the time, Orlando planned to jump from a plane so he could get there faster. Using a parachute, he was determined to jump from a height of 500 above the peak of the mountain, but unfortunately, he got stuck on a cliff. Fortunately, he was strong enough to get to the top safely. He then eavesdropped on a conversation between the shepherd and one of his flocks. The man planned to send the scandal of the American president to the media, and if that happened, America would not be able to help England. Orlando immediately chased the man who wanted to take the film roll, but unfortunately, he was blocked by one of the shepherd's flocks. Orlando immediately fired a flare to give a code to Shola and Polly to seize the film roll while he tried to buy time by fighting the big man. Thankfully, Polly managed to get the film roll, and without wasting any more time, Orlando and Shola had to eliminate all the remaining guards in the mountains. After slaughtering the guards, Orlando and Shola both entered the shepherd's headquarters and were immediately greeted with gunfire. The shepherd then invited Orlando to a sword duel. The shepherd said that he had been waiting for that moment. He had always wanted to kill an English noble because they had made the Scottish people very miserable, but Orlando refused to duel if the shepherd didn't show his face. In the end, the leader of the evil organization showed himself and immediately made Orlando shocked because he turned out to be Morton. Morton then revealed everything in front of Orlando. He had infiltrated the British military for years to become Kitchener's confidant. He always leaked state secrets to his flocks since then. Apart from plotting World War I, he was also the mastermind behind Kitchener's murder in the sea because the general already knew a lot about his organization. After explaining everything to Orlando, he drew his sword, which turned out to have a gun attached to it. Thankfully, Shola came to balk the bullet, and a fierce sword fight was inevitable. Even though he was overwhelmed, Orlando didn't just give up. He would do anything to finish off Morton, who had made him lose his wife and son. In the end, Orlando was able to finish off Morton with Conrad's award medal. He did this to honor his son who died on the battlefield, and with Morton's death, the World War would definitely come to an end. Thanks to Orlando and the team, the American president was no longer afraid to join the war. He burned the film roll and ordered his military troops to help England. Soon, the war came to an end, and King George thanked Orlando for the victory. He was grateful because he did not suffer the same fate as his other cousins, where Kaiser Wilhelm resigned from his position while Tsar Nicholas died at the hands of an enemy who disguised himself as a photographer. One day, Orlando invited King George, Polly, Shola, and his other colleagues to meet in the Kingsmen. He formed a secret organization with a name taken from the shop, Kingsmen, and each member would use a code name taken from English folklore, starting from Arthur, Lancelot, Galahad, Bedivere, Percival, and Merlin. At the end of the movie, Eric took over Morton's position as the shepherd. He invited Lenin to strengthen the organization so that it could rule the world. Apart from Lenin, he also recruited a new member who was reportedly the killer of Tsar Nicholas, and it turned out to be Adolf Hitler.